Hey guys, and welcome back to my series on WSO. In today's video, we're going to be talking about investigating and preparing observation methods and tools. Before you start taking observations, there are three things you need to consider: the context of the observations, how to record observational information, and tools for recording observations. Next, we'll go over setting up an organized storage system and planning, observing, and recording your observations. Let's go over our first point. Before you start observing, you need to take into consideration the context of the observation. You're going to observe and record children's learning in three different situations: participating in the action, stepping out of the action, and reflecting on the action after the fact. Let's talk about participating in the action. When you're participating in the action, you have to establish realistic expectations about how much is possible to record while observing in the action. You're not expected to meaningfully record every behavior or word. The records may seem brief and lacking in detail compared to the records made when stepping out of the action or reflecting on the action at a later time. When you're working or talking with one student, you may be able to record sentence-length comments and anecdotal notes. But when leading a class discussion or working with a group of children, you have to limit your recording to shorthand notes or check marks. Whether working with a single student or a group, planning and focusing are important keys to successful observational recording. Thinking ahead of time about the purpose of an activity and what to expect to observe will help teachers devise recording methods and tools that will facilitate the observation process. Now let's talk about stepping out of the action. It is an extremely effective way to learn about your students. It allows you to focus on one student at a time. A teacher may watch how the children interacts with others or how the child approaches a learning task. When in the midst of classroom action, you do many things simultaneously: motivate students, communicate information, keep students engaged, provide materials, and teach skills. By stepping out of the action, though, you can suspend these tasks for a few moments and be completely observant of the actions around them. Stepping out of the action to observe does not require large amounts of time. You should take no more than 3 to 5 minutes a day to step back and observe one or two children. A short amount of data can be collected in a short time. Rather than being overly ambitious and setting aside large amounts of time, it is more effective to develop the habit of observing out of the action for just a few minutes 3 or 4 times each week. Here are some examples of some anecdotal notes taken by a teacher while stepping out of the action. Lastly, let's talk about reflecting on the action after the fact. Reflecting after the fact involves taking a moment after an event occurs or at the end of the day to document what transpired. You can make mental notes in the midst of classroom action all the time. Recall a math lesson and some of the strategies children used, or a discussion and some comments children made. It is both unnecessary and unrealistic to think about recording something about every child or every event in the day. However, when you make the habit of making a few notes about 1 or 2 children or events each day or every few days, these records add up to a substantial amount of documentation of what children know and can do. In my own classroom, I have a strategy that helps me remember which children to observe each day in particular, so that by the end of the week, I've taken observations of each child for whatever purpose I had in mind that week. During whole group, I seat my children in columns and rows, and I've assigned these columns different days of the week. So on Monday, I know I'll be observing these certain 4 children every time, and then on Tuesday, I'll be observing those children, and so on and so forth till the end of the week. By Friday, I have a complete set of notes over whatever my purpose was for that week. For example, I might want to assess my students' ability to point to each word in a sentence with a pointer. So on Monday, I will pick those 4 students to each do one of the sentences. That way, I'm not taking up too much time each day, but by Friday, I have detailed notes for each student in the classroom. I can apply this strategy to basically anything I want to observe, whether it's anecdotal notes I'd like to take on students' responses to questions about a story, or I might be able to take a quick matrix on their ability to subotize. Always by Friday, I have a wealth of information on each of my students that I can input into WSO. Now that we're finished talking about the context of the observation, you also have to consider how to record your observational information. Let's go over some recording methods. You'll find many ways to record observational data in the classroom. Each technique makes different demands on your time and energy, and each provides a different type of information. You'll find that you can use multiple methods. Deciding on methods to use depends on the type of information you are trying to capture and the amount of observation time you have during classroom activities. For example, if you're interested in how a child thinks, solves problems, uses materials, and interacts with others, you might select a method that allows for some descriptive writing. On the other hand, if you simply want to know whether a child is speaking during class meetings or the materials a child chooses during math time or the colors a child names accurately, you might select a method that involves checking or tallying. When working with one student, you're able to take notes that describe what he or she is doing quite clearly. However, when circulating around the classroom, guiding students' involvement in a science project, making quick check marks on a matrix is easier to manage. Selecting a documentation method depends on several factors: what you want to learn, the activities your children are engaged in, and your responsibilities at the time of observation. Let's go over some descriptions and samples of several different recording methods. We'll be talking about brief notes, anecdotal notes, running records, rating scales, matrices, tallies, time samplings, diagrams, sketches, and photographs, and audio and video recordings. Brief notes are quick written records that serve as a reminder of observed events. Anecdotal notes are much more detailed narrative accounts that describe a particular event factually. Often they're created by jotting down brief notes and adding details later. They provide rich, detailed information. Running records are detailed narrative accounts of behavior recorded in a sequential manner as it happens. They include all behavior that occurs within a given time frame. Like anecdotal notes, they provide rich information but require you to step out of the action. Rating scales are tools that indicate the degree to which a student possesses a certain skill. Matrices provide a way to write very brief notes or make a simple rating of a skill or set of skills for a few children or for the entire class. Names of students are listed on the left-hand side of the page. Specific skills, concepts, or behaviors are listed across the top. Tallies are used to count the instances of a particular behavior or event during a predetermined time interval. Time samplings are used to record the frequency of a behavior over time. Time samplings can be helpful when you need very specific information about a particular aspect of a child's behavior. Diagrams, sketches, and photographs capture the details of certain types of activities and projects, yet do not require lengthy writing. Older students can create these types of records themselves. Audio and video recordings are excellent ways to capture children's language. Skits, puppet shows, storytelling, and reading aloud are examples of this method of documentation. In my own classroom, I tend to favor matrices because I can get so much information in a short amount of time. However, it's very important that you use a variety of observational methods. The last thing you want to consider before your observations take place are the tools you want to use for recording those observations. Depending on the recording methods you choose, you're going to need a variety of tools to carry out your observations efficiently and effectively. It is critical to think ahead and prepare for what is needed so the tools are ready once observations begin. Consider the following possibilities. Mailing labels. Attach a strip or sheet of labels to a clipboard. After jotting notes on a label, remove it and put it on the child's file. These labels can also be pre-printed and dated using a computer. Legal pads. Use large ones to accommodate a whole class list or place smaller ones in several key locations around the classroom so there is always one nearby. Attach a pen or pencil to the pad. Index cards. Attach a card for each child to a file folder with tape so that the cards overlap. Alternatively, color code them by domain and store on a ring or file them in a box. Calendars. You could keep a calendar for each month for each child on a ring or in a notebook. You can keep daily notes on as many students as possible and then, at the end of the month, file the calendar in each student's file. Weekly calendars and large desk calendars may also be used for recording observations. Butcher paper. Hang butcher paper around the room and make notes directly on the paper and attach Post-its to it. Self-stick notes. These come in a variety of colors and sizes and can be used on calendars or placed directly in students' files. Aprons. Wearing an apron enables you to have Post-its and pens ready to record spontaneously as well as planned observational notes. Tablets. You can use these to input observational data. These systems generally allow data to be stored by student, date, and domain. You can also audio record or video record or take pictures with them. WSO provides several forms designed to facilitate the documentation process and can be reproduced or adapted to meet specific needs. They're available on the WSO online platform. Now that we've finished talking about the 3 things you need to consider before your observations take place, now let's talk about setting up an organized storage system. One of the biggest challenges of using WSO is staying organized. Once you've decided on observation methods and tools, it is strongly recommended to set up a system for organizing the data collected. It is also recommended that a teacher file for each child is created. At the end of the year, the teacher file will contain students' checklists, all the collected observational data, the students' work samples, photographs, notes from other teachers, notes from the child's family, and health information. How you create the teacher files is flexible. Some ideas could be to set up one folder for each student containing the types of records I just mentioned. You could also use a large 3-ring binder with a separate section for each student. You can punch holes in the checklist and include it along with the other data and notes in each child's section. I personally prefer using both methods. I like to use the file system to organize data that I'm not going to need on hand, but I like to have the 3-ring binder for things that I need to pull out all the time, like work samples from the current unit, or I might want a blank matrix, something that I can pull out right away and store quickly. Above all, it's important to make this organizational system match your personal work style. For a visual learner, you might want to keep your teacher file displayed so that you can see them easily. If you like to have a clean desktop, you may want to store your teacher files in a file cabinet. If you already have a method that works, there's no reason to change it just because you've started to use WSO. I can't stress enough to find something that works best for you. I've experimented many times to figure out what works and what doesn't work for me. It might take a lot of time to figure out what you like, but just keep experimenting till you figure it out. Lastly, let's talk about planning, observing, and recording. It's recommended that you think about and plan for observation before the school year begins. However, making observations and recording part of the daily experience may be one of the most challenging aspects of using WSO. Many find that creating specific, concrete plans for observation enables them to effectively incorporate observation and documentation into their teaching. Planning for observation involves 4 considerations: deciding what to observe, identifying when and where to observe, preparing appropriate documentation methods and tools, and enlisting support from colleagues. As you plan activities and projects for each week, there's one question to add to the planning process. How will I focus my observations this week? This means identifying the questions you would like to answer about individual learners and small groups of learners in the classroom. For example, in a review of checklists for the class, you might realize that you lack information about students' questioning and predicting skills. You may decide to schedule some open-ended science activities so they'll have opportunities to observe and record this component of the scientific thinking domain. Alternatively, your review of checklists may have revealed some very specific questions about particular students that will shape their observations for the week. There are many ways of breaking down the task of observing all students in all 7 domains into manageable parts. Like I mentioned before in my own practice, I focus on 1/5 of the class each day of the school week, alternating the days focused on each 5th so that I'm watching students on different days of each week. Another method is to choose one domain, a few components, or a particular group of performance indicators and observe all students in relation to the focus for a week. The next thing we want to consider is identifying when and where to observe. Once you have identified a focus, you should review the curriculum plan for the week and decide the times of the day, routines, and activities that are most likely to reveal information that answer the questions. For example, suppose the question is, what do the children in my class already understand about quantity? You should plan an activity or series of activities that will enable you to observe small groups of children exploring quantities of various objects. Additionally, you should note other times when you might spontaneously see children talking about quantity concepts. It's important to remember that finding several opportunities to observe for brief periods of time is more manageable, realistic, and productive than stepping out of the action for longer periods of time. Next, let's go over preparing appropriate documentation methods and tools. Your observation time can be used more efficiently if documentation methods are devised that fit the question and the setting. For example, anecdotal records on index cards work well when teachers have the luxury of stepping out of the action and have time to write, but a class list for jotting quick notes is more appropriate when facilitating group activities. By taking into account the type of information to be gathered, demands on attention, and the students' activities, you'll be able to determine the documentation technique best suited for recording observations. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for joining me on our 4th video in WSO.